Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good night, depending on where you're joining us from. We would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which Monash's 4 Australian campuses stand, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Many thanks for joining today's webinar. My name is Chong Cho. I'm the Director of the Center for Global Business at Monash University. Today's webinar is on how COVID-19 has been impacting lives and well-being of female workers in South Asian economies. It is co-hosted by the Asia Foundation and the Center for Global Business's South Asia Research Network. The Asia Foundation is a nonprofit international development organization committed to improving lives across the dynamic and developing Asia. Women's empowerment is one of the program foci, hence the theme of today's webinar. This webinar will be moderated by Ms. Sophia Shakil, who is Interim Director for Economic Development and Country Representative in Pakistan at the Asia Foundation. I now hand it over to Sophia.
Thank you, Professor Chongwoo Choi. This is my pleasure to moderate this session, which I hope is going to be a very interesting one. It's certainly a very timely set of discussions and insights that we're going to hear today. The Asia Foundation has been working in across Asia. We have through 18 country offices, many of which opened as far back as 1954. And so with, more than now 65 years of continuous presence in the region, we have been working to really focus on expanding economic opportunities, especially especially targeting vulnerable populations, including building community resilience. We work in a range of sectors, including environment, economic opportunities, governance, and women's development. But one of the core areas I think that ties everything together is this focus on building resilience among communities and expanding their economic opportunities. So when the pandemic, upended basically the lives of many across the globe, in particular, the hardest hit were small business owners, medium, small enterprises, vulnerable workers in the economy, especially those working as informal workers or workers actually in the informal sectors or workers in the gig economy. And, we know that this is something that has impacted them the most. But when the Asia Foundation, we started looking at, we started seeing that there's a lot of information, there's a lot of research, a lot of surveys that are being done to look at what are the broad impacts on, the loss of business, the loss of livelihoods and whatnot. A group of us in South Asia thought that, why don't we really take a deeper dive and take a granular look at what are sort of the very, very, sharp asymmetric economic and social impacts on the most vulnerable segment of the population. We decided then that this vulnerable segment is really, the women in the informal economy, informal workers in a range of sectors, from domestic work to those working in other forms of casual day labor, salon workers, small school teachers, private school teachers, and so on and so forth. Obviously, the region is very diverse. We decided to do this study in Nepal, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. These are the countries that signed up. The economies are very diverse, the population demographics are very diverse. Yet we found that, the one common thing was that the women in the informal economy, or generally women workers, face very similar issues. And in terms of the implications for policymakers, we felt that we had a reasonably good, story to tell. Now, the foundation, because of our longstanding presence, we also have, these informal workers, this segment of the economy is really difficult to capture. That is why they often also get left out of the social safety nets and other social programs, because they're not really documented. And it's very difficult, therefore, to get the actual data, to reach out and include them in any kind of survey-based or even some qualitative research. Now, because the foundation has longstanding on-the-ground program experience in these countries, we work through a range of local partners, both government as well as non-government and private, local CSOs, local NGOs. And we were able to leverage, we were confident that we would be able to leverage our networks, our contacts to put together, to help our research partners put that together. And finally, what I was just going to say about this research is that this is what you're going to hear today is really a combination of the rich and very high quality researchers that exist, research institutes that exist in the South Asia region. And, oftentimes because of, the geopolitical impediments, strong, scientific researchers are not able to connect across the borders. We also thought that this might be a nice way to get the discourse going, get some people connected with one another, researchers who care about the same issues and are trying to unpack some of the development challenges so that we can collectively try to present some kind of policy influence in a time when so much is needed. And, as COVID-19 further progresses and unravels, all these cracks, we do want to be able to help sharpen programs and policies that exist that can target and support and help the most vulnerable rebuild their livelihoods. So with that, I am now going to turn over, just briefly go over how we're structuring this and then turn it over to our main presenter. Our main speaker today is Dr. Prabir, who had the very, very challenging task of taking 4 distinct and very rich country studies and to try to tie together a thread that tells a story about, what is it that the workers, women workers in the economy in South Asian countries are facing, and what are some of the policy implications, and you'll get to hear about that. Dr. Prabir is a professor at the ASEAN India Center, Research and Information System for Developing Countries in New Delhi. He is currently today in Calcutta, am I correct, Dr. Dev? And we're really delighted that he will spend about 15 minutes, presenting, delivering his presentation. And then we have a group of panelists. These are really the leaders who shaped and guided the research, coordinated with the research partners, and gave the real depth. They were the ones. I mean, we may have partnered with some research institutes that had great outreach, but these are the people that really have the networks that were able to provide the access to reach out to some of the most vulnerable workers, which otherwise are very difficult to identify. So we have Ashray Pande, who's a senior program officer in our Nepal office. Diya, who's the associate program director based in our India office. Junayed, Jamal, who's the deputy team leader program at the Asia Foundation's Bangladesh office, and Sarim Jamal, who's a senior program officer in the Pakistan office. Together, they form a very lively and a highly qualified group of people who my personal hope is will continue to interact and strengthen their networks, not just theirs and of the Asia Foundations, but of other researchers in around the globe that are interested in issues impacting women, in particular in South Asia. So without more, I would like to really hand it over to our key presenter today, Dr. Dev, if you would please.
Thank you very much, Asia Foundation team, and Sophia in particular for inviting me to make the lead presentation, and thank you very much. What I do in the next 15 minutes, I have started my stopwatch, so I don't want to exceed my time. What I'm going to do, my role here is to, what I did, synthesizing these 4 national studies. And as you said, it was a a great challenge. But to me, it was very learning exercise for me. I work in international trade and international economics. So when I was given this task to look at really most of threatening issues during the COVID time, when we had a very peak up, COVID phase. So I was really scared that whether I will be able to do a job. One task was to guide the national team. They did a fantastic work. I am very, very impressed. These are the things normally as a macroeconomist we look at armchair work, but this is the real work they did. And so I connected them, and I found that there are a lot of key messages and also, some recommendations. Of course, these messages and recommendations are not necessarily the government has to listen, or or multilateral organizations, they have to work on it. But this is a very rich in terms of literature, in terms of giving way forward. If there is similar kind of pandemic happens, a crisis happens, then what should we do for the next round of threats or kind of a similar situation? So with that, I would make a PowerPoint slides I have. And please allow me to go with the slides and basically to present the major findings, key messages, and common challenges. I looked at, that what are the common challenges that the South Asian 4 countries they have presented and connected them. And so let me go there, and I think you'll find you may find it interesting. Some of the challenges that was presented by the national team. Let me share. Yeah. Okay, can you see this? Yeah, I think this is fine. Well, the general overview, the background, much have been already discussed. We have been discussing the background. So I no need to go in very detail what is the devastation and the pandemic. We know all about it. Today, the pandemic is phasing out. It is in, we are at the end of the, or maybe the tail of this whole devastation. But the numbers, they are really very scary numbers. Look at, some of these numbers were not available in the month of July, August, when we picked up this synthesizing work. I picked up the synthesizing work. But look at it for South Asia, because it is the most vulnerable. Around 40 million people, they have been infected by the COVID virus, and 1.5 million people they have lost their life. This number is still growing, but COVID strength has been diluted, and we are expecting a vaccine coming up, but that is another issue. So number is 40 billion is huge number in that way. You can count on Bhutan, Nepal, part of Bangladesh, part of India, part of South Asia is almost 1/4 perhaps got affected. It's huge numbers. Then 500 billion economic loss due to the COVID in the first half of 2020. I mean, equal to the size of GDP of almost South Asian countries if you leave out India and Pakistan. So if you leave out India, Pakistan for the sake of argument, then rest of the South Asia, that is remaining 6 countries, their economy disappeared, just like that. You can explain. And then the forecast says, there is a light coming up at the end of the tunnel. This 2021, we might pick up the pace, but the GDP, 500 billion combined, disappeared. So you can think that you really do not know when you get back to the 500 billion again, plus additional markup, which is you have lost between the years. This is a huge task, and it has a huge long implications. So longer implications are more than short term. So that's what the new studies, and you will all agree with me that it is between the food security versus nutrition. It is between job versus employment, like that. And the pandemic has disproportionately impacted women workers, marginalized communities, SMEs or MSMEs in South Asia. And there are a huge amount of cultural similarities. So you don't have to distinguish between this disproportionate impact between the countries. This is almost, similar, very similar. And why? Because there is an existing structural inequalities, against the gender inequalities. So that's the reason, we found that once this pandemic happened, who got the major shock? Those who are in informal sector, those who are women workers, those who are, in vulnerable class, they got the shock. People who are in the formal sector, well off, they get busy to look after themselves in a very, very casual way, if I may allow to say. And then there's a rise of poverty. Particularly, I emphasize, if there's a crisis happens, there would be a rise of poverty, of course. But the point is the rise of female poverty. And I'm not talking about inequality. Inequality which is again another dimensions. We haven't seen any kind of study as yet, but there's a rise of female poverty in the age group of 25 and 34. And it's a huge number. Women is more vulnerable, particularly the women workers, and long-term implications of the pandemics are more than the short-term impacts and the complications in between, intricacies of this long-term implications that one has to look at. And that's what we tried, these 4 national studies. We're going into different parts of the country, picking up the field-level data, compiling them, and then coming out with analyzing and coming out with recommendations like that. And when we talk about the disproportionately impact of the women workers in this pandemic, why? Because as I said, there's a gender inequality is already in the system. And what kind of lower wages for the women, fewer educational opportunities, limited access to finance, greater reliance to informal employment, and there are many constraints, just like in Nepal. Nepal and Bhutan were about 86% of the female workforce labor participation rate in the economy. They drive the women, they drive the countries. If I may say, in very general term. And Nepal in particular, they depend on the remittances. So due to the COVID, when countries they shut their border, the flight got discontinued. So the Nepal was heavily impacted because it is a remittance, a foreign aid dependent economy. And look at 86% of the female workforce in the Nepal, they are driving, working in the front. So they got heavily impacted because of the cut of the foreign remittance. So there are dynamic implications, not just within limited in a boundary of a national economy. I hope the panelists today, they will talk more about it. And the post shock or post crisis, what happened to those who got hugely impacted disproportionately? Those numbers, those field results, I'm also going to present, and these are really scary. And I think, and we South Asian countries, they need to talk each other, understand, and may help countries to facilitate sort of a long-term plan, and more particularly the women workers, the child, like that. So let me come to the objectives and aims of this regional synthesis report. It is the 4 countries. I would have thought that there could be more countries like that, in Afghanistan in particular, or Sri Lanka. Perhaps in the next stage, if Asia Foundations or others may like to pick up those. These are based on both field level data and also the key informant interviews. Both are very important, as you can understand, that during the COVID time, still we are in the COVID time, but in the peak COVID time, all got disconnected. So the surveys were done by telephone, doing a lot of hard work. It is not just going with the questionnaires and going to the field, there are lots of back and forth. And then when we did the national review, many of the cases I asked them, and they're very kindly, they looked at revision of the field survey, sometimes extra data required, etc., etc. They did brilliantly. So for the total sample survey was 1,719, of which Pakistan alone has contributed, more than 80%, 1,124, Nepal 452, India 43, Bangladesh 100. And there are women employers, women workers in the formal sector, in the informal sector. So it's the, this study is, we got the sampling done, and we picked up different clusters. It is just not like, one side of the, all, the field data that we picked up. So it has a different colors, and that's what we need, when we're going to do a kind of a policy. The 4 studies quickly, their aims and objectives, almost similar to each other, to understand the COVID impact on the women workers. Like, Bangladesh, they attempted to, based on the field survey and the KII, the pandemic impact on women employers, particularly in the garment industry. India looked at the gig economy, and the Nepal looked at, it is quite widespread across in the country, hillside, in the Tarai, the valley side, and they did a huge, effort to pick up the real data, and the Pakistan, they have looked at a, professor who did in the LUMS, in the Lahore University. They did a brilliant study to look at the women and impact, COVID-19 impact on the women and the challenges they have been facing in Pakistan. These are 4, and you can see the 4 studies, national studies, they have very common linkages. So let me go back to the major findings quickly, because I have only now 6 minutes to end. And national studies, I'm sure Asia Foundations, the respected officers will be available. So if there is any interest, please refer those. Because of the lack of study time, I won't be able to go in very minute detail. And here, I'll a little bit faster because of the time constraint. Like in the Bangladesh, and you can see the bar chart is given, the challenges faced by the women workers and employers. This is about lack of financing, because Bangladesh studies, they looked at more into, women employers, because the supply chain disrupted. There was a huge rise of inventories in the factories, uncertainties. There are policy announced at the government level. Women workers, they were very dark about that, and it takes time, leading from a policy and a very macro level and coming to the down level. It takes time, I understand, in the South Asian countries. So those are very much, there in Bangladesh. So many of them lost their businesses. There are supply chain disruptions, layoffs. Of course, there's a fear in mind. What would be the future? Today, we are very confident that yes, this is going out and market will come back. But in July, June, May, these were actually not there, and are very, very, in a very bad situation. And India, this is where, this is slightly different than other 3, because India study look at kind of a case study, the gig workers, women workers in the gig economy. And we found, the study indicates that there's a drastic fall of income. Those who are working in the gig, platform gig workers, as apart from gig workers, because of job losses, difficulties in the work environment. And when we see that those are working in the informal sector, particularly here, there is a definitional constraints, and there is a depleted savings, loan, liabilities, etc., etc. And as I said in the beginning, there are very much gender inequalities already there, in the structural inequalities there. So given that, so it is very difficult for the woman worker to cope up with the challenges. Very difficult, because the male counterparts will always be dominating them. So this we have seen in all the 4 studies, and particularly in India on the gig economy of workers. And I'm sure that will be more debated when we have a panel discussions. In case of Nepal, there's the reduction in the sales and revenue of job losses, high rise in domestic violence. Both in Nepal and Pakistan, they reported the rise in domestic violence. And as you can imagine that, the women workers in the informal sector, when they lost their job, the formal, when they're back in the home, so violence on them goes up, because they have been asked, they were asked to do harder work without any payments. So those are picked up by the real-time data and by the field survey, quite revealing, all this. And of course, the Nepal issue is the sheltering facilities, quarantine facilities, the containing management. So Nepal and Bhutan, particularly Nepal, was the last in South Asia, joining this bandwagon. Initially, we thought there won't be any COVID much, but people are thought that we are very strong in immunity, we have a very strong, DNA, etc., etc. So that may not affected us, but later we found, that is completely myth. Everyone, got affected heavily. And there are, a huge disruption, huge shocks in Nepal in different dimensions. Pakistan, rise in financial losses and vulnerability, declining in employment. Those are almost similar to in other 4 studies. And here the bar chart, it indicates that incidence of domestic violence, physically threatened, physically assault, and physically assault on children. These are 3 huge, percentage increase, during this in the COVID time. And what are the common challenges among the 4? If I may, common challenges for economies, if you look, the job losses, these have come in the top, followed by fallen income, business contraction, rise in unpaid workload, rising stress and anxieties, rise in domestic violence, financial losses and vulnerability, no government stimulus. No government stimulus means I have to do a disclaimer, because government has announced the disclaimer. It hasn't reached at the time of the survey. And the lost business of women MSMEs. Now, lost business of women MSMEs, stimulus of financial, these are the things where, you can take in a very short-term measures. One person has lost a business, you go to bank, take money, there's a stimulus, etc., etc. But when there is a rise in stress, anxiety, rise in domestic violence, fallen income, a job loss, these will have a very long-term impact, right? Very long-term, medium to that. Those are the points we need to highlight, and we need to debate, discuss more. Now, let me go to the recommendations to safeguard and promoting women's participation. Bangladesh, what study suggested, major 5 recommendations. One is that it should be the streamlining delivery and financial assistance for the women entrepreneurs. Adopt an innovative financing model that would ensure quick access to finance for women entrepreneurs, because the bulk of our interviews, the respondents are the women entrepreneurs in the government industries. Introducing and the target-based approach, promote sustainability of women-led MSMEs, and establishment of an women development bank. The last one is very, very, I'm very impressed, because this is kind of an action-oriented suggestion. Establishment of a women development bank. This is very important, because a development bank with an woman driving, managing it, will be more concerned with the women issues. And this Bangladesh is not only just Bangladesh, also in South Asia. But the India study indicates, there's as I said, the definitional issue, formal, informal workers, and when there is a change of kind of a scenario which was not there in the past, like the gig workers, kind of an app-driven programs, the jobs which used to be driven, the male, the workers now being done by the woman, the female. So then, it comes that what kind of definition should we adopt? So this is a big lesson for India, that the definition should be changed and be more concerned with the women issues. The recommendations suggested, which is the social security system for the gig workers, these are not there. If it is an informal economy, social security certainly doesn't appear. If you were working in a formal and on contract, no social security, just like that. Social security from the employer side. Social security, which is an individually done, that is a different thing. Clarify the application of sexual harassment in workplace, lower effort platform. This is very much rampant, sexual harassment in everywhere in South Asia, particularly in workplace in urban part of India. Upskill the platform or gig workforce, especially the women. Ensure fair play and the balance between demand and supply, and bring about an ideological change in formulating and implementing workers in India. What about the Nepal? I highlight the point, the skilling requirement, which is very important. Again, it is an action oriented. This can be taken up by the government or the multilateral bodies like ADB or the World Bank and others. Return migrants from Gulf or anywhere, skilling is required. And a small amount of investment in the skilling, they can give a huge marginal return in the economy. And of course, the study is quite extensive, and there are many lessons. The one I said, that is skilling, which is very important for. Of course, there are other things which is in the governments, civil society have a very strong role, like when it comes to, quarantine facilities, quality improvement, or sexual violence, like that. Pakistan, there are many recommendations, and those are very important. Like Pakistan is introduced kind of a safety net called SHAS. SHAS means solatium, blessings, particular to the female informal and gig economy-based workers. But we need to see, sometimes government just come out with a policy, but really that implemented or not, that is where we have to concentrate more. Then he talked about the monetary incentivizing mechanisms of the SHAS. Started with 1,000 rupee, maybe it has to be enhanced to 5,000 in coming years. If someone going to the bank and pick up a loan to do some small business, bank should give them, remove any burden on them and give them free money. You take the money and do a business like that. The launch, and there are several recommendations in Pakistan studies. Those are very highly important, and there are lessons for other countries as well. And I found that many of them are can lead to a regional programs. Final slide. The key messages coming from this regional synthesis of 4 national studies. One is the women workers. We all have to agree that they got disproportionately impacted by the pandemic in South Asia. It's still continuing. It's not over. As I said, it's a long-term impact. It's more. One disproportionate impact is over. Another comes to the woman and the child. Second is so we need to be very, very concerned about it, and it has to be seriously dealt with the governments at the national level and also the subnational level. Point number 2, the gender concern are not yet stepping the decision, mainly by the male leaders. All the decisions, relatively speaking, with the male leaders, the women leaders are not coming in there at all, or not being discussed. So this point to be underlined. I should be very vocal about it. This has come out in the studies. Then introduce a special protection, social protection, measures for the women workers, both formal and informal sector. How it can be done? There are, suggestions given by through the field survey and key formal discussions. We had with experts and opinion makers, the leaders. They have given the ideas, and we can draw from other programs as well. First 3 are very much, which can cover the short-term issues and medium-term. Then there should be a way to include women in every decision, response, and recovery decision making. This is where I think not there actually. Decision making, recovery decision making, and women consultations. Those were missing. Maybe at the very macro level, national level, but when you come to the sub-national, you don't find. South Asian countries may come out of the crisis. What we are discussing in the morning, that if the vaccines are made available, on a small scale and freely, that's what my personal view. Give the vaccines to everybody in South Asian countries, and there should be some kind of a close coordination. On 15th of March, India Prime Minister took a first meeting on SARC, South Asia's COVID management. 15th of March, out of their shared interests, and many things happen after that. So if that's done, so I think that South Asian countries should call another meeting or through video conference, find out a strategy how they will distribute the vaccines. India can take a lead here. I think that's what the message should go to all the 8 countries in the South Asia. And last one is there is a very strong regional policy coordination is required to the common challenges. For what? To minimize the duplications. If India is going to provide the vaccines, or Pakistan, or some countries in Bangladesh, we call little bit coordination will help us do it effectively. If further training and skilling required, the Nepal or Bangladesh women and entrepreneurs, new scheme, new market. So kind of region. There are lots of opportunities here. This regional study and national studies indicate. So this is, I stop here, and I think that we'll have more discussions when we go for the panel. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Day. That was a very comprehensive overview and very challenging to pull together some of the common threads that we've seen despite all the diversity, as well as, like, as you said, you know, the 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 different waves at which people were actually hit by this way, a pandemic. Some common challenges, I think, in terms of the challenges you've presented, but also some of the recommendations. I think very, very, you know, important, the importance of immediate safety and social protection nets, but also skilling, and then economic stimulus packages, so that you can do both short-term recovery as well as long-term resilience building. So now I would like to turn over to our panelists and have them share their insights from the respective country studies and speak, you know, briefly, but 5 minutes each. So may I please turn it over to Ashray in our Nepal office. And just, sorry, Ashray, I do note that, you know, I've made a note that any questions that any of the participants have, please park them in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and we will get to them later. I already see one comment. So, sorry, Ashray, please go ahead.
Thanks, Sophia. Thank you, Dr. Day, for a wonderful presentation. Thank you to my colleagues who led the country-specific studies, Sophia for moderating, and Monash University for hosting, and of course, everyone for taking time for the discussion today. You know, being part of the study and the presentation has really shed light on the range and severity of impacts, both economic and social, being felt by communities across South Asia and the world due to COVID-19, including Nepali women in the workforce. You know, building on Dr. Vay's findings, I'd like to speak a little bit more on Nepal's current context, challenges, impacts felt by women, and how the Foundation's programs in Nepal are pivoting to support the recovery, with a particular focus on women migrant returnees and entrepreneurs to ensure a more inclusive and effective response in the post-COVID-19 environment. As in other countries, in Nepal, the socioeconomic conditions being observed at home and additional expectations as caregivers in families has placed tremendous amount of pressure on women to manage responsibilities. Findings of this study in Nepal indicate that out of the 450 women that were interviewed across the country, 41% have lost their jobs. 88% of them have seen incomes decreased. 44% are reporting difficulties in sustaining their families. COVID-19's toll has depleted savings, heightened debt obligations for families who have now increased borrowings through formal and informal networks. You know, the decreased incomes and loss of employment has also impacted other aspects of livelihood, like nutrition, education for children, and more alarming, the rise in domestic violence, as previously mentioned by Dr. Day. Given these statistics, you know, an important data point in Nepal is the makeup of the informal economy, where 84.6% of the total working population are engaged in the informal workspace, where women make a major share of that. You know, being daily wage earners has really disrupted the lives of women and taken many families below the poverty line. Similarly, 83% of businesses interviewed are also operating at a loss. 30% have issued pay cuts on their female employees. 21% have laid off their employees and reduced working hours. Women-operated businesses interviewed in the survey that predominantly hire women have also been hit, given the government's categorization as non-essential services, as well as a lack of targeted relief measures for businesses like massage parlors, hairdressers, as well as those involved in household domestic duties. You know, high-risk sectors like construction and manufacturing, where women are employed, have also taken a hit. It's also really important to note that Nepal went into an early lockdown in late March 2020, which was extended up till July. But despite placing public safety to contain the virus, there has been an exponential increase in cases. You know, lockdown and forced travel restrictions has also affected mobility, transportation, crippling the ability of women to be employed and actively participate in the labor force. You know, Nepal, albeit with its own challenges with the crises, is responding to the pandemic. You know, social protective schemes for women in the form of cash transfers have been announced by the government. Debt relief, loan refinancing, and restructuring for businesses, in particular subsidized loan facilities targeting women entrepreneurs, have been also introduced as part of the government's budget and monetary policies. You know, with 3 years into the first election cycle, COVID-19 has placed significant demands on federal and subnational governments. The pandemic and lockdown has also delayed the government's ability to provide timely services and approve policy measures to deploy relief. This has been further complicated by, you know, the challenges in streamlining operations, systems and processes, and human resources to operationalize Nepal's nascent federal system. Given these challenges, subnational governments, in particular municipalities, have really stepped up and have been responding as frontline service providers. But despite social and policy protection measures being provided, one of the notable highlights in the Nepal report includes a gender-based information gap due to a weak gendered lens in the government's recovery mechanisms. This has resulted in not only an inequitable relief distribution, but access to information being provided by the government. In the Nepal study, 65% of women respondents were aware of the services, but only 31% have received support. Same with businesses. The lack of information on eligibility and the application criteria has really created barriers to entry and accessibility of funds and services. Targeted policies like the subsidized loan facilities and collateral-free lending for women as part of the government's 50 billion rupee refinancing fund announced in the latest budget hasn't really taken off. Stories of women being turned away when applying for relief support due to missing paperwork like citizenship or being disqualified for running a business raises concerns over the government's relief distribution criteria and approach. So the focus this coming year should be really to ensure that communities with a special emphasis on women and marginalized groups have foremost the access to the information on services being provided by the government to ensure relief and financial support to the most needy and vulnerable in the midst of the pandemic. Supporting women to upscale their skills and match that with private sector, supporting women-led businesses to navigate the requirements for relief measures, accessing credit and financial resources will be vital for a quicker and stronger economic recovery. And based on some of the findings in our various programs, the Asia Foundation's Nepal office has been really pivoting to support and aid in the recovery of women and marginalized communities by foremost, number one, improving equitable access on information related to relief measures, financing subsidies provided by the government to strengthen the information gender gap, strengthening data and evidence-based decision-making capabilities of local governments by helping to collect information on returning migrants, women-led households, and vulnerable groups to improve relief distribution and services. Given the expedited growth in the e-commerce sector and the digital economy, we're also ensuring inclusive access and knowledge to women entrepreneurs in this growing space, supporting them with teleworking methods, digital platforms, and helping them reconnect to market linkages that have been disrupted by the pandemic. And finally, we continue to work with our institutional partnerships with the government, civil society, private sector, and business associations to provide targeted support and advocacy to improve the resilience of women in the new normal in Nepal brought by COVID-19. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ashray. I mean, very sobering and very powerful. Thank you for sharing the insights from Nepal. Diya, can we go over to you now?
Sure. Okay. Thank you so much to everyone and to Dr. Day and our hosts, Monash. I won't take too much time, but I'm just going to emphasize a couple of the points and dive a little bit deeper into the gender angle of this discussion. Since their study was published, in fact, in India, we have a new sort of code on Social Security 2020 for which the rules are being drafted. So this also includes Social Security for this select group of, platform-based gig workers for the first time. They're still working out the modalities with regards to sort of who's going to shoulder the burden of the payments and how they're going to define a platform-based gig worker. But I think that's still a little bit, at least there's a conversation that's been initiated. This is a really interesting area of work that in India, the Asia Foundation is pursuing. It's a sector, the gig sector in India has really grown very exponentially. And while that's great, the unfortunate part is, as some of my other colleagues have also mentioned, that it's all been sort of done with a very gender blind approach. So no one is really taking into consideration the sort of unique lived experiences of women who are working in this sector. And that way, it's great that we were able to do a little bit of research into this area. This is a very interesting sort of line of work for a lot of women. And sort of the gig sector in India is really led by very young entrepreneurs, and what we've noticed is, they're sort of very well positioned to capitalize on opportunities to have policies that are a little bit more progressive and inclusive than, let's say, normal companies. So there's a scope to sort of initiate conversations around gender equity, around diversity and inclusion, to see how some of these sort of more progressive principles can be built into some of their, the policies of gig-based companies. For example, in India, Zomato, which is a really huge food delivery giant, they announced that they were going to provide menstrual leave for women. So, these are the kinds of, I think, modern and forward-thinking policies that would really encourage women's participation in the gig sector. So that's something to watch. My colleagues mentioned that, I think across South Asia, women, with COVID-19 have just suffered, burden of job loss, not only in the gig sector, but I think broadly also. And, in India, this was particularly the case for rural women, but also the other one to sort of watch is for women with young children. So the whole concept of the motherhood penalty, during COVID-19 essentially became even more amplified. So that's another sort of cause for concern, along with, the drop in incomes that Dr. Diya and others mentioned also. And the drop in incomes and access to work for the gig sector was actually much worse for women, because in India we have a big company called the Urban Company, which is a platform-based mobile gig sector aggregator, and their men's grooming services actually expanded by 5 times. So it's not that the entire sector was stopped growing. It grew. It just didn't grow in the areas where women were employed. So I think a lot of the gender norms that already divide women's work into sort of traditional, teaching, nursing, childcare work versus non-traditional, plumbers, electrician, technicians, etc. That's the reality of our society in South Asia, which is then also mirrored into the gig sector. So women in the gig sector are basically sort of engaged in very gender-specific work areas like beauty, like wellness, and as a result, because those are such sort of high contact, person-to-person jobs, and they're not really essential services like plumbing or electrician work, women are just not engaged in those sectors. What happened when there was the COVID lockdown is that women just didn't have any work, but men continued to be hired, within a couple of weeks, even after the lockdown sort of started opening up. So, the idea is to sort of also look at how we're going to move women away from these low value added services. How are we going to unpack and sort of break down some of the barriers? Ashray, you mentioned mobility. The same thing with India. I mean, I think a lot of the women who are engaged in the gig sector depend on public, transportation. And there's mobility issues after dark in some of the cities here in India. So that automatically restricts the time of hours that women can use to productively earn. Then there's the issue that Dr. Diya mentioned about the, childcare and elder care, sort of the home responsibilities, which is actually called the second shift that all of us women work. So we do our regular day job, and we also have the extra job of managing everything at home. And that's, the same thing for women in the gig sector. What is interesting though is that because they're not stuck in this 9-to-5 kind of in-person job, they can choose their own time. And that flexibility is very attractive for a lot of women entering this line of work. So it doesn't mean that, the double burden doesn't go away. It just means that it's, sort of managed a little bit better. Another major barrier that I'd like to highlight is really the access to digital technology. And, we talked a little bit about, some of the financial handouts from the government. A lot of the financial handouts were actually, could be accessed using digital technology, but a lot of women don't have that access. And it's the same thing when you think about whether they'll be able to actually join the app-based gig sector, because you have to be A, you have to own a mobile phone, and B, you have to have internet access, and C, you have to be able to actually, be trained and handle, sort of using the phone to book your jobs. So, I think in the next 10 to 15 years, 20 years, there's needs a lot more investment on sort of closing the digital gender gap, because if we don't, then women are going to continue to be, falling more behind. Before I end, the last point I really want to make is it's about skilling. And I think that's true across South Asia. In India, with the gig economy as it's growing, we have to work much more on ensuring that, women are going to be well prepared for a much wider pool of jobs within that sector and not just in one or two areas where they traditionally have been present. So how are we going to ensure that women are able to seek out jobs? Maybe it means making sure there are more jobs closer to where they live, because a lot of women prefer to work closer to home. So, looking at how to create those jobs so that they don't have to travel very far, for example, and they have the right skills. So yeah, I'm just going to end that, by saying that the gig sector is still evolving, but it's moving very, very quickly. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for civil society, for governments to work together, along with the private sector leadership of these companies, to really create an ecosystem that is much more gender equitable, at the design stage, which is where we are right now, and much more inclusive. So both of these coming together so that we can have a more thoughtful and meaningful, present more opportunities for women to increase their participation, particularly in a post-COVID sort of reality, which is what we're dealing with right now. So I'll end there, and I hope I haven't crossed over my time.
It's okay, Diya. Thank you so much. I mean, I think you've really highlighted the importance of skilling, but bridging that digital divide. Yet at the same time, the complexity of that, women have women to diversify their skills base so that they are in sectors which, enhance their livelihoods, but also are, safeguarded from some of these shocks. And this builds nicely with the kind of what we heard about the gender-based information gaps that Ashray talked about, and that how, policymakers and these programs fail to even keep this vulnerable segment in the net. So can we move over to Junayed in Bangladesh?
Thank you. As for Bangladesh, I think as for my colleagues from both Nepal and India have spoken, and we have similar challenges. And in terms of the COVID scenario, and also one of the participants actually asked a question, I think I will try to concentrate on the small and micro cottage industries in Bangladesh specifically, where many of the women have their SMEs and they have more female employees working in Bangladesh. The government stimulus package was quite big, but in terms of how it got disbursed and the number of women helped by that package was not significant. And unfortunately, the way the commercial banks were supposed to disburse and everything, the governance was not there. So if I highlight the package of 200 billion Bangladeshi taka that was earmarked for the SMEs of Bangladesh, there was no distinction between rural and urban. So the traditional challenges that women face in terms of getting a loan, that was already there. But during COVID-19, what happened is that one of the main identification of a woman SME owner is their trade license. If they are registered, they need to get a trade license from the local municipality or the local government basically. So during COVID lockdown, these local government institutions, they usually run their core expenses from the tax or the revenues they get from their own places. They are not assisted by the central administration. So during COVID-19, due to the lack of resources for them, their main core employee base, they had to run that. And for that, the say $5 trade license fee, they pushed it up 7-folds. So any budding woman SME owner, I mean, usually they do not renew their license every year. So they faced a huge challenge in terms of getting their trade license, because they were now having to pay 7 times more to get that identification, because without that, their first paper is not even ready. So many of the existing women SMEs, they also face challenge, because usually if they do not take a loan, they usually do not renew their license. So even we've seen that women have like 7 years default payments to be left to be paid. So these kind of challenges also existed for the commercial banks to make for the applicants to be eligible for loan packages. And the commercial banks also applied some unspoken rules. For example, they wanted, this was not driven by the central bank, but they wanted 3 years of at least to have the women SME applicants having 3 years track record of having the trade license. So this posed a huge challenge for the, especially the small cottage level women-owned SMEs and the budding ones especially. So uh, in terms of how we, I mean, the loan packages in terms of the month of July, I think almost this package was supposed to reach 4.4 lakhs. That means approximately 500,000 women and men owned SMEs basically. But overall till now, this has reached only 130,000 SMEs across Bangladesh. So the main target, one of the another gap was that these commercial banks, they had this lump sum amount given by the central bank, and they were supposed to be disbursed this, but without any target given framework. For example, like there was no distinction between rural and urban, nor there was any distinction between male-owned or woman-owned SMEs. So during the pandemic time, the banks actually had more confidence in SMEs who had already relation with them. So they usually got the bigger chunks of loans. And the interest rate was also quite low. At 4% interest rate, the government gave out this stimulus package. So there was some nepotism, and there are other instances by these commercial banks which actually did not benefit the target women SMEs, especially in the rural areas and especially the small ones and the budding ones. So our financing scheme that was more adaptive and more responsive to these women SMEs was much needed. And for example, the project that the Ashray Foundation implements, I mean, out of the 500 SMEs that we directly work with, by the month of June, July, August, only we found recorded that 3 or 4 of these SMEs could access this stimulus packages. So that was a huge impact, especially for these rural SMEs. And also there was another vicious cycle that the employees, for instance, the government did not have any safety net for them. So when the pandemic hit the country, many of these SME owners were investing in their employees, giving them a minimum amount of monthly salary to keep them on board as far as they can do. So basically, they could not invest any business diversification. They were investing in their employees. So because of the lack of this coverage, comprehensive coverage from the government of safety net programs, the targeted SMEs suffered a lot, and we have a lot of gap in terms of policy framework from the central bank that we can further discuss on this and take it to the government. Central bank's policy reform advocacy can be done with this. And if you have any specific questions, I can address that too.
Thank you, Junayed. That was, it just adds so much more depth and just actually just verifies what we've heard from the others. Now, it's truly challenging, I mean, that how such, people who just, are just making it can get so impacted so rapidly. And again, we see the gaps that we've heard from our other colleagues. So Sarim, can we move over to you, and then we'll open up the panelists to answer some of the questions that are being posted.
Of course, Sophia, and thank you very much to the previous panelists, my colleagues, because a lot of the findings, are applicable to Pakistan as well. Like, for example, what Ashray and Junayed just mentioned about, there being a gap in terms of information, there being even a gap when there are government mandated programs being present, right? So this demands more research, more insight, and more mainstreaming for this very niche sort of a segment, right? And like Diya mentioned, the digital divide is very real, and it gets exacerbated, it gets worse for this segment due to constraints regarding technology which women in South Asia face at this level. So I think, for Pakistan, what I want to do is basically highlight, for the researchers, for, the different innovation drivers like students and academics and even, private sector representatives, those people who are present in, watching this webinar and who'll also, watch in the off cycle later, what can they think about this segment in mind for Pakistan? How can they leverage the insights that we built in order to make a cogent perspective to take action for this segment? So make no mistake, the situation is really dire. I think Dr. Prabir highlighted that very comprehensively, that it is a very dire situation for this sort of segment. And I'll just tell you, but there is always opportunity in adversity. And I think, students, civil society, and innovation drivers can actually take the lead and leverage this sort of informal women workers segment, especially in Pakistan. Because, and I'll argue that for three premises, right? Number one, what the data basically tells us is that this is a very resilient sort of a segment. Because at least in our data set of about 1,100 people, 90% stated that they survived without state-based safety nets. So this is a segment which is used to austerity, which is used to, actually rolling up the sleeves and doing the hard work, right? And I think that would be very essential for any sort of innovation driver, let's say entrepreneurs, angel investors, whoever is thinking to, actually invest in this sort of sector for long-term growth. I think the characteristics of this sort of segment is really bright for them in order to, generate positive economic activity. And the second thing is, right, whoever sort of researches in this sort of sector within Pakistan and whoever invests in this sort of sector, they have to realize that this sector actually requires it, because our survey stated that 2/3 of the respondents claimed that, in the next 6 to 7 months, which is early 2021, they're expecting a very sort of depressing business environment in which they will have to, actually literally go and be in survival mode. So I think this sort of webinar is very timely because it can, create a critical mass of researchers and practitioners who can go in and work for this sort of segment, right? And the last thing which I found, very realistic and very sobering as well was that we asked one question, one very straightforward question, in which we asked, what is your priority? Economic well-being, safety, health, what is your priority? And 86% of the respondents said that, it all boils down to economics. How will they survive? How will they, just due to the gig nature of the job, how will they eventually go on and, consolidate and safeguard their livelihoods? So with this data being said, right, I'll just quickly sum it up. I think students who are taking this webinar and who will see it on the on cycle and off cycle, they have a very rich sort of niche segment to explore, because the sort of nexus that this sort of segment has with economics, gender studies, sociology, and even digital business and digital sort of transformations, right, are paramount, and they need a lot of work to be done. And for, foundations like us, for the university and other civil society members, I think this is a target segment that requires a lot of intervention, just so because their issues are very real, and this sort of segment wants to do the work, but sadly, it hasn't gotten institutional levels of support in order to, build their capacity. And lastly, for the innovation drivers, for the investors, from the micro scale to the macro scale, from the little firms, from individual neighborhood investors to large scale apps like what Diya mentioned with Zomato and everything. I think, this sort of segment, and I'm really doing a sales pitch over here, based on the questionnaire that, we saw, this sort of segment is one of the most hardworking segment. An 86% data set is not statistically insignificant. It is very statistically significant that they want to do the work. And it's time for all of us, in whatever capacity we are, as students, as researchers, as practitioners, as small scale investors or large scale investors, is to really, focus on this segment, because it will return dividends and it will ensure prosperity regardless of the South Asian economy in which we are. Okay, so that's all for me. Please, direct
Thank
any
you,
questions.
Sarim. Thank you, Sarim. And that's a really important point that, without women, which comprise, over half the population across our countries, that without their real productive participation, we're not going to see the kind of economic growth that we, our individual countries want to see. So definitely a very important point. And I think, all of you have done, Dr. Day, your presentation, again, set the tone for a very, very complex kind of diverse region, but nicely brought out some of the common challenges, as we already summarized. And these interjections by our country focals have really shown, the more granular issues being faced by women workers and the multitude of the impacts that we're seeing. So, and some very important recommendations. We do have a couple of questions that have come both in the Q&A box as well as in the main chat. So I will, I see that Diya has already answered the one from Nawaz Kotwal regarding women and gig economy. And we can come back to that maybe again in as the question, but Ashray, I think you were going to take on the question to share your views about how do you think women would be able to receive more support, especially when they're competing more against other segments? If you want to attempt to answer that.
Thanks, Sophia. Great question. I mean, it's not only against competing other sectors, but just the increased responsibilities that women have really taken on both at home and the work front. As I mentioned earlier, many have left their jobs given competing priorities and responsibilities. But in terms of allowing women to really compete and take charge of various facilities and packages provided by the government, it takes a effort, both a concerted effort both by the public sector and the private sector to really align matching needs and priorities in terms of what jobs are available and what jobs are required by the private sector. And I think that's where the government really needs to come in and provide incentives, investments in terms of scaling up jobs, research and development to really identify what skill sets are required for women to be active in the labor force, given this huge shift in the digital space, where in the future is still as uncertain and new skill sets are required. So I think it's a kind of a two-pronged approach and collaboration between both the public and the private sector. Thanks.
Thank you. And we have a question. Diya, would you like to take on
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I think the question was about the digital gender gap and how to bridge that. That's an excellent question, and that's something that I think applies to all of us in South Asia, but even beyond that. Actually, the digital gender gap is worse in South Asia even compared to sub-Saharan Africa. And that's not a very new statistic from the World Bank, but I'm sure it still stands. I have to check it, but that just goes to show how serious this problem is. In terms of how to address it, I think that there are very I think if we start with 5 key steps, that'll be a way to start. The first is, of course, as a lot of us have mentioned, is really about ICT and digital education for women and girls. And we have to start that at a fairly young age so that girls are very comfortable, promoting girls' participation in STEM related activities. There's not a lot of participation generally of women, I think, in the tech sector. So one way to do that is to really encourage women to join ICT content creation, innovation, encourage the internet use for women and girls. In a lot of families in South Asia, usually there is like one, if there's a tab or a mobile phone for the family, it's usually used by the boys or the men in the family. So I think that civil society has a large role to play to get into the community level and encourage, the use of digital technology for everyone in the family, including girls and women. I know that the Gates Foundation is doing a lot of work in this area, and so I would encourage everyone to look up some of that work and see if there are ways that we can work with them or partner with them to help close that gap. The other issue is also about safeguarding, the online privacy for girls and women, which is a major issue with cyberbullying and with online violence. That's also a largely unexplored area. So a lot of girls don't feel very safe online, and that's why parents also don't want them to be online. So these are some ideas for us to start with, and I'm happy to also take that conversation forward with you in a side note. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Diya. We also have a question from Observer Sharia regarding the role of South Asian governments and, it would specifically what kind of financial support women entrepreneurs are receiving from the government in Bangladesh. And we've heard a little bit about, from Junayed on the different stimulus package, and we, and then from others as well. But Junayed, do you want to maybe expand on that a little bit? And then if Dr. Dey, since you've taken an overview perspective, if you have anything to add in terms of what, generally it could be a stronger sort of feature of what governments can do across South Asia.
So for Bangladesh, as I did address a bit of it, but I mean more specifically, if I say that even the next package that the government is thinking about, there's a strong feeling that unless access to loans by these small and micro enterprises are significantly eased, the objective of the government to reach out to these firms won't succeed. Because the bottlenecks and the way the banks, commercial banks, are given this stimulus package fund, they can just dish out to the bigger businesses, and as it has been with the first package, where 70% went for the large industries, which were actually meant for the small businesses. So we're gonna again fail, and there has been discussions about how the women chambers of commerce can also be brought in as an institutional support mechanism for they have rural, they have subnational presence too, so they can also assist in terms of getting women their documentations ready and their papers ready, and other functions they can help the commercial banks to be tied. But again, commercial banks needs to be given targets by the central bank in terms of number of SMEs they gonna give out these loans to, in terms of rural and urban division, and also between men and women, how many women SMEs are to be provided loans by these commercial banks. If such policy framework is adjusted, then I think it will be meaningful.
Thank you, Junayed. Dr. Dey, do you have
Yeah.
anything you'd like to expand on, please?
I just to add, what the other South Asian countries are doing in terms of, giving an assistance to the women workers and women MSME owners. So I found that, countries like India, in particular, and Sri Lanka, what they have done, kind of in a moratorium, extended moratorium for the loan if women, entrepreneurs they have taken from the bank. This is one. It's kind of a 3 to 4 months extra, payment, to maintain kind of a moratorium, that you don't have to pay for the 3 to 4 months, if they have taken a loan. This is one. Second is the rescheduling of the interest rate and the monthly installments payments for the banks and financial institutes for their loans. This came out in the Nepal field survey report, and differential payment arrangements, particularly for the retail loan segment, if there's anything, if the women entrepreneurs in particular, they have taken from the bank. So this is 3 I found, in South Asia, India and Sri Lanka, and Nepal to some extent they have introduced, with a particular focus on the women employers, women MSME and SMEs. This is I found. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you. And I think, just to build on that, I think, in addition to the, to some of the very timely and in some cases quite vast, amounts of responses that the government's put in place, I think one of the things that has come out in all of your, in the discussion and in the national reports is that, there's a real gap in information, but also in implementation and delivery. So those are things that I think, as all of you have talked about, I think are really important to have filling in that gap, and that can be done through research, but also building up databases, involving the chambers of commerce, involving other organizations that have the outreach and can help build that. And so I think the message that we would like to give out to policymakers across South Asia is that there's a real important need, and Diya has said this, to collaborate. This isn't, you can't solve these issues and problems even in the short run, and especially not in the long run, without getting all the different players on, to do that. The other is, of course, we've heard again and again, is the real big need for skill development. Can't emphasize that enough. Now, I think Malvika, you have a question regarding, you're curious to know about the types of M&E data that the private sector collects in relation to women in the gig work that they support. I think Diya could quickly answer that. But in the meantime, Diya, maybe you could type live, type or answer live, but I would just take an opportunity now to invite more people if they would like to raise their hand, pose any more questions. We've got Dr. Dey with us today, as well as, the country focals who would be pleased to answer any of your specific questions.
You can just give a quick answer to Malvika's question.
Sure.
Which is no.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The answer is no.
No.
So that's what I was saying in the beginning about how the whole thing being so incredibly gender blind, So that's an area that we can certainly pursue.
For sure. I think, again, comes back down to, capturing the information and then involving the women in, and keeping them at the forefront of design of programs and policies. Is there anything else any of you are my colleagues at the foundation, or Dr. Dey, would you like to add? I don't think we have any more questions from the audience.
Well, I went to the questions as well, just to kind of what South Asian leaders can take a lead from the study, and what policymakers they can do. In the South Asia, the SARC process, there is a kind of a momentum that is picking up, because the common challenge, and that started with this pandemic. And I think this is the only study, I underline, only study done by the foundation within a national as well as the regional perspective in mind. So I think it's a foundation. They should publish it, spread it, disseminate the findings as quickly as possible. There is a discussion going on. that let's come back to reactivate the SAC process in the post-recovery activities. And as I said in my presentations, so this study will be very much helpful to SAC countries to take and or at least to start a discussion or coordinate post-recovery programs in the South Asia. That's what I suggest. Thank you.
I think it's a very useful interjection. I really think that it's important that we get this on the top of the policy agenda. And this is something that I think has spillover effects as well, what's done at national level. And I think we need to maybe, and putting people first, that's the soft side, right? And that is probably apolitical. It can be delinked from all the other contentious issues and promoting the people-to-people contact, but also then, ensuring that the region flourishes with, with more women participating in the economy, in the labor workforce. We're going to see huge amounts of benefits to the entire region and their economies. Okay, so we're well within time. And I do see one more question, okay, from one of the participants. Are there any accountability and audit processes the governments are introducing to review implementation of support programs? A very important question. Would any of our country colleagues like to address this? Well, if I may,
go
ahead, please.
It is if it is an audit for accounting purpose, an audit to evaluate the government implementation, the program of security. If it is audit for accounting purpose, those associations or civil society organizations, the government, private, they have taken money. They have to face the audit in any way to
like through the public accounts committee or whatever the normal mechanism
is. It is not it's not a free money that you take and you do whatever you'd like to do. So they have to face the audit because the government has to present their audit at the end of the financial year to the respective parliament or in the respective place. Thank you.
Well, I would add. I mean, thanks, Dr. Day. I mean, yes, across South Asia, we have very strong public accounts and audit mechanisms in place. And part of the problem is that, sometimes this is the one on the flip side, because there's such a high level of scrutiny and accountability. Oftentimes public funds are not spent because, there's there's a fear of like accountability and, audit. However, I think the important thing is, and this relates to the monitoring and evaluation and directly then linking to the efficacy of implementation and delivery of these programs and support, programs to the individual communities. And that's where I think more is needed. And that's a good recommendation to sort of flesh out, which is that, it's not enough just to say that everything was distributed. It's the quality. It's, are the people who really deserve it still falling outside the net? And now that's not something that, you can say let's say all the programs are successfully dispersed, but are they reaching the ones that are most deserving? Do we need a review of the targeting mechanisms? Do we need a review of expanding the net? Do we need additional resources? So those are important questions. And I think that's a very valid question that has been posed and has several dimensions to it.
If I may add?
Yes, please.
Very quickly.
Sarim, yes.
Yeah. I think, this is a very broad and future-looking question because just coming back to this sort of segment, right? Informal women workers in South Asia. And Dr. Day can perhaps, shed more light on this very quickly. But one of, at least in Pakistan and the readings with the regional report was that for this segment, right, exclusively this segment, government mandated safety nets have been very low. Like for all across, there has been a lot of focus by governments on, mitigating the effects, the economic effects of COVID. But part of the motivation of why we did this study was that, this specific segment, informal women workers, which have a milieu of issues, ranging from the digital divide to the asymmetric gender dynamics that are present in South Asia, right? So I really value this question a lot, but I think before we go on to this question, I think governments need to respond more to the needs of this segment first, right? And then perhaps we can go on to the traditional MEL and accountability frameworks.
Okay, thanks, Sarim. Do we have any additional comments or any last minute interjections that anybody wants to make? No, then I would really like to thank, first of all, Monash, the Center for Global Business, in arranging this in partnership with the Asia Foundation colleagues. I would like to really thank all of my colleagues who have really carried this research from, built it up from taking on really the challenging task of defining what is it that we're going to look at in terms of that could actually lead to some common and shared impacts and assessment. And I think the focus on vulnerable women in the economy has been the right direction for us, because this has shed light on a lot of the gaps that are actually impacting even many other vulnerable groups. We've come out with a few, very important recommendations, and now we're in the process of just sort of, finalizing the reports. We will share those through our network, so hopefully those of you participating will be receiving copies, electronic copies. I really want to thank our host, the event organizer, Shahab, as well as our host, Professor Chong Woo Choi, for this opportunity. And again, a great thanks to our participants as well. So with that, thank you very much.